Good evening, everyone. My name is Sharissa Tanner, and today I will be presenting my educational leadership action research project titled Improving Student Behavior and Accountability Through Restorative Practices in Middle School Classrooms. As a middle school teacher, student behavior is something that I deal with every day. Over the years, I've noticed that traditional discipline methods don't always create the long-term behavior changes we're hoping for. Students may receive consequences, but many times the behaviors continue to happen. Because of that, I wanted to explore whether restorative practices could help students become more accountable for their actions while also creating a more positive classroom environment. Today, I'll discuss the purpose of this study, the research process, the findings, and what I learned through this experience. One thing most educators can agree on is that behavior has a direct impact on learning. When students are constantly talking, refusing to follow directions, arguing with peers, or disrupting instruction, everyone loses instructional time. In middle school, students are still learning how to manage emotions, communicate effectively, and make responsible decisions. Unfortunately, traditional discipline often focuses more on punishment than teaching students how to improve their behavior. I began asking myself a simple question. What if we spend more time helping students reflect on their actions instead of simply punishing them? The question, that question became the foundation of this project. Restorative practices focus on communication, accountability, and repairing harm. Instead of asking what rule was broken, restorative practice asks who was affected, how can we make things right? I wanted to see if that shift in thinking could make a difference in my own classroom setting. The problem I focused on was student behavior and accountability. Many middle school students struggle with following expectations consistently. These behaviors often lead to classroom disruptions, lost instructional time, and strained relationships between teachers and students. Traditional consequences may stop the behavior temporarily, but they don't always address the root cause. Because of that, I developed two research questions. The first one asks, how do restorative practices impact student behavior in middle school classrooms? The second asks, how do restorative strategies influence student accountability and reflection on behavior? These questions guided the entire project and helped determine what data I would collect throughout the study. The purpose of this study was to determine whether restorative practices could improve behavior and increase accountability among middle school students. My goals were simple. First, I wanted to reduce classroom distractions. Second, I wanted students to become more reflective about their behavior. And third, I wanted to create a classroom environment where students felt heard, respected, and supported. The significance of this study goes beyond behavior management. If students can learn to take ownership of their actions, communicate effectively, and repair relationships, those are the skills that will benefit them both in and outside the classroom. As future educational leaders, we have a responsibility to explore approaches that support students while also creating positive learning environments. That is what inspire this research. Now that I've explained the purpose of the study, I'd like to discuss the methodology that was used. The project utilized an action research approach because I want to investigate a real problem within my own educational setting and identify a practical solution that could improve outcomes for students. So the study was conducted in a middle school setting and included approximately 66 and seventh graders, students across three classrooms. The classrooms were selected because they had demonstrated ongoing behavior classroom concerns, including classroom disruptions, off-task behavior, and accountability challenges. One of the reasons I selected this population is because middle school students are an important developmental stage. They're learning responsibility through decision making and how to manage relationships with others. Because of that, I felt restorative practices could be especially beneficial. To collect data, I used several different instruments. These included behavior tracking logs, office referrals, records, student reflection forms, teacher observation notes, student surveys, and restorative circle participation records. Using multiple data sources allow me to gather both quantitative and qualitative information. Behavior logs and referrals provided measurable data regarding behavior incidents, while surveys, reflection, and observations allow me to better understand students' experiences and perceptions. To analyze the data, I compared behavior trends before and after implementation. I also reviewed student reflections and survey responses to identify common themes related to accountability, communication, and classroom climate. Throughout the project, confidentiality was maintained. Students' names were not included in any reporting, and all the information was used strictly for educational research purposes. Before implementing the project, I reviewed existing research related to restorative practices. One thing that became very clear was that restorative practices are not a new idea. Many schools across the country have begun implementing them as an alternative to traditional discipline systems. The literature consistently shows several benefits. Researchers found reduction in office referrals and suspensions, improvements in student and teacher relationships, increased student accountability, and stronger school culture. However, another important finding was that successful implementation requires consistency. Many researchers emphasize that restorative practices are most effective when teachers receive training, administrators provide support, and restorative approaches become part of the overall school culture. The literature helped confirm that this was an area worth exploring within my own school environment. The implementation period lasted 6 weeks. During week one, baseline data was collected and students were introduced to restorative practices and expectations. During weeks 2 and 3, restorative circles and reflection activities were implemented consistently. Students were given opportunities to discuss concerns, resolve conflicts, and reflect on their choices. Weeks 4 and 5 focus on continual implementation, while additional surveys, observations, and reflections were collected. Finally, week 6 focus on analyzing data, review findings, and identifying trends. Throughout the process, I continue monitoring student behavior and documenting changes as they occurred. Now, I like to discuss the findings. The quantitative data showed some encouraging results. At baseline, there were 28 documented classroom discussions and 11 office referrals. As restorative practices were implemented, both numbers steadily decreased. By week 6, classroom disruptions had decreased to 10, and office referrals decreased to 3. What I found most encouraging was that the improvement wasn't sudden, it happened gradually over time, which suggests students were beginning to internalize the skills being taught through the restorative practices. The steady decline indicates that students were becoming more aware of expectations and taking greater responsibility for their behavior. When looking at the overall results, classroom disruptions decreased by approximately 64%. Office referrals decreased by approximately 73%. As a classroom teacher, this finding was especially important to me because fewer disruptions mean more instructional time. Teachers were able to spend less time managing behavior and more time focusing on teaching. Students were also able to remain engaged in learning rather than being removed from instruction due to disciplinary issues. These improvements suggest that restorative practices had a positive impact on classroom management and student behavior. Student survey results provided additional support for the effectiveness of classroom restorative practice. 82% of students reported a better understanding of classroom expectations, 88% reporting feeling heard during classroom discussions. 79% believes restorative conversations help solve problems, and 84% believe classroom behavior improved during the study. One thing that stood out to me was the percentage of students who reported feeling heard. Many students simply want opportunities to express themselves and know that their voices matter. The survey results suggest that restorative practices help create those opportunities. Several themes emerged from the student reflections and teacher observations. The first theme was increased accountability. Students became more willing to acknowledge mistakes and accept responsibility for their actions. The second theme was improved communications. Students were more willing to discuss conflicts respectfully and communicate concerns before situations escalated. The third theme was increased self reflection. Students demonstrated a stronger ability to think critically about their choices and identify ways to improve. The fourth thing was stronger relationships. Teachers reported more positive interactions with students and improved classroom culture. Overall, the qualitative findings supported what was observed in the quantitative data. The first research question asks how restorative practice impacts student behavior based on the findings. Restorative practices had a positive impact on student behavior. Behavior incidents decreased consistently throughout the implementation period. Teachers reported fewer classroom disruptions and improved engagement during instruction. Students appear more aware of behavioral expectations and demonstrated greater self control. The findings suggest that restorative practices can be an effective strategy for reducing behavioral issues in middle school classrooms. The second research question focused on accountability and reflection. The findings showed that restorative practices increased both. Students became more willing to discuss their behavior, reflect on their choices, and identify better responses for future situations. Rather than simply accepting the consequence, students were encouraged to think about how their actions affected others. This process helps students develop greater ownership and responsibility for their behavior. Overall, five major findings were emerged from the study. Student behavior improved, student accountability increased, communication improved, relationships became stronger, and classroom climate became more positive. Together, these findings suggest that restorative practices support both behavior growth and relationship building. These outcomes align closely with the existing literature and reinforce the value of restorative approaches within educational settings. When comparing my findings to the research, there were many similarities. Like previous studies, this project demonstrated improvements in student behavior and accountability. The results also supported research suggesting the restorative practices encourage students to become more active participants in solving problems rather than passive recipients of punishment. One lesson I learned from this project is that behavior improvement often begins with relationship building. When students feel respected and supported, they are more likely to respond positively to interventions. Although the results were encouraging, there were limitations. The study included only 60 students and was conducted within one middle school. The implementation period lasted only 6 weeks. Because of these limitations, the findings cannot necessarily be generalized to all schools or student populations. A longer study involving multiple schools will provide additional information regarding long-term effectiveness. Several additional questions emerged from the study. Would the results be similar if restorative practices were implemented school-wide? Would improvements continue over the entire academic year? How might restorative practices impact different grade levels? And what types of professional development are most effective for supporting implementation? These questions provide opportunities for future research and continued improvement. Based on the findings, I developed several recommendations. First, restorative circles and reflection activities should continue to be used regularly. Secondly, teachers should receive ongoing professional development related to restorative practices. Third, school leaders should consider implementing restorative approaches school-wide to create consistencies across classrooms. Finally, schools should continue monitoring behavior data to evaluate effectiveness and guide decision making. This project has important implications for educational leadership. As future leaders, we are responsible for creating environments that support academic and social emotional growth. The findings suggest that leadership prioritizes relationship centered approaches to discipline. Leaders must also provide the resources, training, and support necessary for successful implementation. Creating positive school culture requires intentional leadership and a commitment to supporting students as whole individuals. This project has also influenced my own professional growth. One goal I have established is to continue learning about restorative practices and behavior intervention strategies. As I continue my leadership journey, I want to support teachers in creating positive classroom environments and reducing behavior challenges through proactive approaches. I also hope to share the findings from this project with colleagues and advocate for restorative practices within my school community. In conclusion, this study demonstrated that restorative practices can positively impact student behavior and accountability in middle school classrooms. Students showed greater reflection, stronger communication skills, increased accountability, and improved behavior. Teachers observed fewer disruptions and stronger classroom relationships. Most importantly, the findings reinforce the idea that meaningful behavior change occurs when students are given opportunities to reflect, communicate, and repair harm. Restorative practice focus on growth rather than punishment, and that approach has the potential to benefit both students and schools. The final slides contain all references used throughout this project. I would like to thank my professors, mentor, teacher, colleagues, and classmates for their support throughout the program and throughout the completion of this action research project. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I appreciate the opportunity to share my findings.